Well, I would put it a different way. They would like, I believe, nothing more than for the U.S. To become embroiled in a war with Iran. This is, I think, part of the goal. A wider war, we shouldn't think, is something that Israel is trying to avoid. It may well be something that Israel is trying to provoke. This is rather typical of, I don't know who the client is. I was going to say a client state manipulating a great power. I'm not sure who really the client is here, but Israel manipulates the United States, and it's happy it's got those aircraft carriers in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, and now it is hoping, I think, that this could be the chance of Netanyahu's long-held desire that the United States would join a war against Iran. So we shouldn't think of this as a miscalculation on their part. Of course, it would be, again, unimaginably horrific. It could escalate into everything because it could bring in other superpowers, and probably would bring in Russia. Who knows what would happen? And let's be clear, there are lots of fools in the U.S. that also won't mind a wider war. We've got a warmongering group in the Senate, Lindsey Graham types and others, who always want expanded war. So we shouldn't think of this as a miscalculation. We should think of this as a provocation. If it's maybe the ethnic cleansing will work, maybe it will lead to a wider war. Either way, not so bad, says Israel. Of course, their real miscalculation is a different one, and I think it is a very serious one. They're losing the United States. Israel is losing the United States. They don't get that. Just like Biden can't imagine doing anything against Israel, the Israeli leaders think they own the Congress and the U.S. political system, and that is coming to an end, and they do not get that. Just like our Congress doesn't understand our students, Israel certainly doesn't understand what's happening inside the United States right now. And Israel can't go on a day with this without the United States backing it in munitions and backing it diplomatically and geopolitically. So I do think Israel's making a huge miscalculation. I think they're making a cruel calculation to start with, of course, but they're making a huge miscalculation, but not exactly the one that you're pointing to. They're making a miscalculation that they have the United States in their pocket, so they can basically think of the U.S. military as theirs to throw against whatever enemy they want. That is a falsehood. They're going to learn the hard way. I think, in fact, if this continues in this horrific way, the two-state solution really will be gone, and Israel's very survival in the long term will be deeply threatened by the approach that Israel has taken. I see no disaster greater than Netanyahu. He's really a piece of work that has done untold damage to Israel in his tenure as prime minister.
And it wouldn't be the first time.
Well, he sees the end possibly coming.
For himself.
Jim, go ahead, please.
Well, he sees the end possibly coming, but it's his life's work preventing a Palestinian state. Exactly. And one of the things you brought up, and you may be right. All of this is planned. I don't like to engage in conspiracy theories, but was it all planned in order to lead to another Nakba where Palestinians could be expelled out of Israel? And certainly some cabinet ministers have basically proposed that, saying that Western countries should accept Palestinians in to give them shelter so that they have a future in another place, because they don't want them to have a future. But you tried to talk a little bit before the United Nations about what we need to do to rebuild. The day, even if, let's just suppose that there is a ceasefire coming, and what do we do on day 2 Gaza is all but gone. You talked about getting 10% of the defense budgets of leading countries around the globe to invest in a sustainable reconstruction of Gaza and the Palestinian occupied territories. But, how do you get people to go along with that? Because remember, I mean, when they're doing deficit spending, somebody's benefiting, meaning Raytheon, at Omnia. They're benefiting from all of these wars. And if you stop that, if you take away 10% of that, that is a lot of money.
People are going to suffer for years and decades out of what is happening in these days, without question. The loss of life, but the destruction of hundreds of thousands of homes, the dislocation of 2 million people so far. This is devastating, and the destruction in Gaza will have a price tag that under any circumstances the world will not cover. So people will suffer and will be dislocated and impoverished and without any ultimate solution or compensation to this. But what will happen, and it will drive me crazy, by the way, thank God the day the fighting stops, then we'll have a donors conference. And the governments will get together and say, oh, we're going to commit tens of billions of dollars to rebuild what was just destroyed. And it's so stupid that we behave this way, because a lot of my life and career is about trying to raise any funds for impoverished people, getting kids in school, building health clinics. And the idea that you bomb places and then throw the tens or hundreds of billions of dollars at what you just willfully destroyed, but you would never come up with such funding for just helping poor people in the first place is the reality. And remember, it's as we muse about who's going to rebuild Gaza, and the answer is nobody is going to rebuild much of it. The Ukrainians, they actually hold meetings thinking, oh, we're going to have a $750 billion fund for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Yeah, good luck with that one too. So this is tragedy compounding tragedy. Of course, we have a doctrine in general in economics, an incentive doctrine, which is the polluter pay principle, which is you make the damage, you pay. That's how our courts work also. If it's a trespass or a noxious tort, a public nuisance is the legal term. Israel should pay for this. It destroyed Gaza. It should pay for this. Well, let's try that one. That one's not going to go too well either. But that is that's the principle that should apply, so that a government thinks twice before it destroys another place.
So it's interesting because it moves us. There's a couple of areas I'd like us to cover as we're kind of nearing the end of this great, interview, Jeff. One area is the economics of war and peace, and I'd love to. For you to comment on the juxtaposition that we're seeing now. On the one hand, you've got the utter destruction of Gaza, which is a fairly small place. I mean, Gaza is not this massive World War II kind of Marshall Plan for Western Europe. It's just basically the size, less than the size of Manhattan, I mean, in the grand scheme of things. However, on the other end, you've got a damaged Israeli economy that's basically shedding hundreds of millions of dollars on a daily basis. By an estimate, it's about $12 billion worth of economic, well, that's not opportunity cost, that's direct cost to the war so far in the 60 days. Add to that the opportunity cost for the 300,000 reservists. And
the destruction of the shipping now, which is blocked in the Red Sea, and ships turning away, all of that.
And you're seeing a reduction. Even Israelis are starting to leave, which is fascinating. I was reading somewhere that between 300 and 400,000 Israeli, presumably productive ones that don't want to waste their time on on nonsensical wars, they're going to go to the West and be productive and safe with their families and stuff. So you've got that also going up. And in parallel, and I know you were just in Doha not long ago in the Gulf, and you're seeing this unbelievable wealth creation that is happening in Saudi, where essentially there's been a doubling of productivity just by allowing women to enter into the workforce. And you've got, all that going on in the Gulf, just a complete buildup of that. And if we look at some of the demographics, we're looking at maybe 20 years ago, the Arab world was about 220 million. Now we're about 470 million. And by some projections, the MENA region is going to be 770 million by 2050. And you're seeing this juxtaposition, of these stories. How do you see that playing out, And can really Israel sustainably, from an economic perspective, still sell itself as being this strategic beachhead for the United States at a time when the United States, if it so wanted, has an entire region that's larger than the actual landmass of the United States itself, with potential 770 million people that it can alienate or pacify? I mean, how do you see that in your mind playing out?
Well, I think there are a number of issues here. First, this is very, very costly for Israel, and that's good because maybe it means that Israel will stop what it's doing. Israel cannot afford, ultimately, the greater Israel approach, which is the approach of ethnic cleansing or continued apartheid over the West Bank and Gaza. It doesn't know that yet. It can't sustain U.S. backing for that. It can't sustain the isolation that will come from that. It can't sustain the ongoing fighting that will come from that. So that's one part. More generally, war is, a good business for 5 companies in the military-industrial complex in the United States, but for the world, it's a totally rotten business, of course. Not only does it create tragedy, but it creates mass destruction that is extremely costly to pick up, and the direct outlays on armaments worldwide now is probably $2.5 to $3 trillion. The estimate is about $2.5 trillion, of which the United States is typically measured at $1 trillion, but it's actually much larger than that when you count all of the budget item lines, maybe up to $1.5 trillion a year. So this is all costly, all wasteful. I every day invoke Isaiah, the 8th century prophet whose words are on the wall just across the street of the UN on First Avenue, chapter 2, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations won't make war on nations, neither will they learn war anymore. He's speaking economically. We should be transforming our armaments into productive activities. This is unbelievable waste, stupidity, and danger, what we're doing. Again, these wars could end essentially immediately, because I also like to quote Karl von Clausewitz, the war theorist in Germany after the Napoleonic Wars, who said that war is the continuation of politics with other means. And his point was that war is a kind of politics. So I say, look to the underlying politics. The underlying politics of the war in Gaza is, will there be a Palestinian state or will there be greater Israel? Well, the only answer that can possibly lead to peace is a Palestinian state. And we should cut to the chase and go straight there. As I mentioned, when we look at the war in Ukraine, the underlying politics is the United States trying to push its military to the border of Russia, to surround Russia in the Black Sea, an idea that Zbigniew Brzezinski described in detail in 1997 and that the U.S. has been trying to carry out. It's led to disaster. Again, it's politics. So if we want to stop the war, it's not military that will do it. It's politics that will end these wars, and they could end immediately. We'd save a fortune. The people in the world would be hugely benefited. Of course, those under the bombs first and foremost, but all of us would benefit. Maybe Lockheed or Raytheon shares would go down a little bit. That would be just fine.
Can I ask a question about Lebanon?
Go ahead, Tariq. And there is one question I wanted to get a comment from Jeffrey on.
About Lebanon and the situation in Lebanon and the UN resolution 1701. Now it's back on the table, and Amos 16 is being back and forth to trying to implement borderline and the resolution 1701. Any information on that and the IMF plan for recovery of Lebanon? What do you have for Lebanon? What do you would like to say for the Lebanese audience about these two topics?
I
need another hour.
I wish I could help you on that more specifically, but precisely while that debate has been going on, I was at COP28 and then in Ethiopia, just got back yesterday. So my consultations with diplomats on that start this week.
Would you comment on COP28? What's your take on it? And do you think, as is being reported, it's at least an acceptable move forward? Did it disappoint you in terms of its reach, or were you actually surprised given that it was held in an OPEC, at the end of the day, in an OPEC nation, and something did come out of it at the end?
I was glad that it was held in the Gulf region, and I think the president of COP28, Sultan Al Jaber, did a very good job, and the outcome is, as these things go, good. Now, I say as these things go because there's paper and then there's reality. And the paper document that came out is a step forward, definitely. The reality is that the big powers are all directed at these war and peace issues, not at this climate issue. And until we end these wars, we're not going to get the kind of real political capital to decarbonize the world economy, to face up to the financing challenges, and so forth. So I go to COP meetings, all these conference of the parties each year, and they're big, interesting jamborees. There were nearly 100,000 people there. A true measure of massive world interest, massive business interest, massive civil society interest, massive scientific interest. But in terms of superpower politics, that's not where the real answers are. And right now, the superpowers are in conflict and in war, and we've got to end that so that they focus on something absolutely real, which is making the planet viable from a climate point of view for the 21st century.
Well, Jeff, I think, I don't know if any of my colleagues has any more questions, but I do have one last question for you. And it's something that I heard you say, which was, obviously I've known you for a long time, but it's still impressive. It's you stated, and I quote, "Peaceful coexistence is about mutual respect, not to believe that one is the chosen one to rule in a particular place or to rule in every place." And I thought that was a really interesting quote, because you kind of, in many ways, highlight the aspirations of a lot of people who are more on the peace side of things, realizing the sacrifices that might need to be taken. But I'd love for you to comment on this, and whether you look at the next few weeks, months, years in an optimistic tone, or whether having been in development and having been in the throes of geopolitics and the UN for such a long time, whether you've reached a point where you're looking at it more from a pessimistic perspective or an optimistic one.
Let me mention two things. First, immediately in the Israel-Gaza war, those Israelis, and that includes this current government and the cabinet, that believe that Israel has the right, and they would say a God-given right, to rule over the Palestinian people or over the Palestinian territories is the essence of this conflict. And it's unacceptable. And the people of Israel need to live side by side with the Palestinians in peace, and it's perfectly possible to do. But they have to give up their aspiration to rule all of the land. And some Israelis believe that's what the book of Joshua gave them, or some biblical interpretation, and it is has to be put aside. Nobody has that right. Not from God, not from a book of the Bible. People have to live decently, and they have to respect each other. And that's the only way we can survive on this planet. When it comes to the United States, it's even more grandiose. The United States ideology is, and Biden repeated it recently, the U.S. is the indispensable country. It's the country the world looks to for leadership. This is false. It was always false. But in the heyday of the 1990s, when the Soviet Union ended, maybe there was maybe that delusion could be at least a little understood. Is the U.S. really the country the whole world's looking to right now, when it stands alone against the rest of the world? Of course not. The U.S. needs to learn to cooperate. It needs to learn to put aside its own delusion of hegemony. And there are leaders, in fact, it includes this very government, Biden, Sullivan, Blinken, Nuland, who really believe in U.S. hegemony. Well, it's a nonsense. It's a fiction. It's worse than an anachronism, because an anachronism would imply that it was maybe once true. It was never true. And so this is the similar kind of terrible falsehood that needs to be put aside if we're going to get to peace.
Doctor, last word. Is the UN time for reshuffling, time to restructuring, time for new laws for the UN to be more effective, to be able to defend these people? It's time for change in the UN?
Well, I love the UN, first of all, as frustrating as it is, because it is the place where the world meets, and it's the only place where the world meets. And when the world meets, it speaks with a huge voice: peace and justice for Palestine. So it's pretty impressive. Now, it has a voice, but it doesn't have an army. It doesn't have its own tax authority. It is a club of 193 nations. It was founded by nations. It was founded by nations. This is important. It's not global government. It's United Nations. And this is a bit of a problem. I'm in favor of more power, for example, some direct tax power, so that at the global level, we can get some funding for poor people or for emergencies or for other things that we need. Now, next September, there will be a summit of the future at the UN. This is a once in a generation. In fact, it's the first time ever that such a summit has taken place. And Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called on the world, think about what we want and what we need for the balance of the 21st century. And we will meet the 22nd and 23rd of September. By then, hopefully, there will actually be some creative agreements reached about the kind of restructuring or strengthening of a new multipolar world and a stronger set of UN institutions that can work for the 21st century. So I'm a believer. I know in history, we've never had global governance. This is only the second attempt in all of world history to have this. The first was the League of Nations. It failed within a generation. The United Nations is 78 years old this year. It is, as I say, I love it, and it's incredibly frustrating. that we can't solve more problems in the way we need to. But we should understand this is a new attempt in human history to have global scale governance. So I don't want us to give up on it. I don't want us to be cynical about it. I want us to fix things so that we can actually make it work.
Right now, we are seeing that the United States and Israel it seems that they are preparing to fight Yemen Houthis. How serious is that in your opinion, and why they're doing this?
Well, the whole situation is very serious because there is no end game in sight. Israel is trying to impose solutions in the region that are unacceptable. First, domination over Palestine in an unconditional way through its military power backed by the United States, and it's making threats against other parts of the Middle East. So this could obviously spiral into a wider war very soon. And it's all premised on Israeli government policies that are, in my opinion, flagrantly against international law and international decency.
Why the United States, why the Biden administration, instead of going after negotiation, finding some political solution to this issue, they're prepared to do everything, whatever the Netanyahu administration is asking for?
This is a neocon policy to fight wars anywhere and everywhere, to always escalate, and to believe that not only does might make right, but that might can solve political issues. It's pathetic, but it's not really different from other dimensions of U.S. policy. It's just blatant, flagrant arrogance and disregard for international law and disregard for what global opinion and American opinion say. After all, the world overwhelmingly has called for a ceasefire. And in the most recent UN General Assembly vote, it was 153 countries calling for a ceasefire, and the population of those countries is 89% of the world population. 10 countries opposed: the United States, Israel, and a few other small countries. The total population of those that opposed was 5%, of which 4% was the United States. So the U.S. was joined by 9 other countries that represented less than 1% of the world population. In other words, this is giving a finger, if I could put it crudely, to the rest of the world, saying, we don't care. We don't care what you say. We don't care what you call for. We don't care for peace. We'll do it the way we want to do it. This is not only the United States backing Israel, this is the United States alongside Israel, because Israel couldn't fight one day by itself. It needs the munitions every day from the United States, and it's getting them.
Yeah, you talk about ammunition. Jake Sullivan just recently said that they are taking care of this ammunition, these weapons that are sending to Israel, that they are not using against civilians.
Well, this is ridiculous. There are 18,000 dead minimum, 2 million displaced, hospitals, schools, basic physical infrastructure, apartment buildings, all destroyed. And even the New York Times, which is, of course, rabidly pro-Israel, and I mean pro-Israeli government policy, notes in an article today that a substantial proportion of the bombs are dumb bombs. They're not guided bombs. They even quote Mark Milley, the former chief of staff of the U.S. military, saying that this is wrong. You need to use guided missiles to avoid the civilian deaths and damage and injury. And of course, they're not doing that. Does Jake Sullivan know that? Of course, he knows that. This is part of a U.S. foreign policy that is as out of control as Israel's foreign policy. That's the problem.
The other issue that it's much more serious than Yemen is Hezbollah in the north. Israelis, they were talking about if it was necessary, they want to attack Hezbollah. Hezbollah has the same rhetoric. How do you see right now the situation in that region?
It seems, although I don't have any direct evidence because I don't speak to the administration, they certainly don't speak to me, but it seems that the hardliners in Washington and the hardliners in Jerusalem in the Israeli government want a wider war. They're not taking steps to avoid a wider war. They seem to want a wider war. I think it's Netanyahu's dream that the United States goes to war with Iran. Because if Israel could get the United States to take out Iran, and that's their idea, imagine that. But all of this is grotesque cynicism and miscalculation as well, because what could happen would be devastating for the whole world if this continues to escalate. And they're playing with that. You notice that Israel hasn't taken one moment, not one measure, not one iota of an approach towards diplomacy. Nothing. No call for diplomacy. Incredible disrespect for the United Nations, disrespect for the rest of the world. Obviously saying every day we don't care about the rest of the world. We don't care about diplomacy. I think one of the things that will happen is that support in the United States for Israel will collapse. Actually, it's already collapsing among young people, and I think the collapse will be more widespread. Even that doesn't necessarily stop the U.S. government from doing what it's doing by any means, because foreign policy is hardly an area of democratic deliberation. It's a small cabal that runs things, that controls the military. They don't really ask for permission. But we see in Ukraine how an exasperated public finally has some influence on some members of Congress enough that there isn't just a blank check for more armaments. This is very surprising given how much our Congress likes to write checks to the military industrial complex. But the public is pretty much disgusted, and Biden's support is falling sharply. We have an election year this year, so it's possible that the exasperation clearly expressed in opinion survey after opinion survey will finally result in some action by the U.S. government to put a stop to this massive devastation.
At the end of the day, what is so important is how these actions would benefit the people of Israel. What's going on in the mind of the Netanyahu administration? How possibly they can think that all these actions would benefit Israelis?
They are engaged in ethnic cleansing right now, and that is the goal of this government. This government is an extreme right-wing government. Netanyahu's party, the Likud, has, since its charter in 1977, demanded one state of Israel, commanding all of the territories of Palestine, as well as the 1967 border Israel. In other words, the land from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River should be Israel. That's the policy. That's the policy across the cabinet. That's the policy of these religious Zionist parties. For example, the finance minister Smotrich and the defense minister Gallant, who's Likud, and the Interior Minister Ben-Gvir, who is another party calling for, quote, greater Israel. That's their policy, is that there should never be a Palestine. There should never be Palestinian political rights. This is Israel. And a lot of the public supports that. And a lot of the public follows the line of the administration, the Israeli government, that is, that the only way to safety is to smash Palestine. And so the situation is going to continue, I think, if it's a matter of internal Israeli policy. But it's something that Israel can't do for a day without the United States. And the U.S. has no interest, no national interest, no ethical interest, no geopolitical interest in being an accessory to mass murder.
How do you see the left, the center, political parties in Israel? Because the left is so weak right now. Why the Netanyahu administration during all these years did this to the left, to the center?
There's basically no left in Israel. It's a few seats in the Knesset, in the parliament. The Israeli political scene has shifted to the far right over the years. It didn't just start on October 7. This is something that's been going on for years. Netanyahu represents and those parties represent a larger viewpoint. Israel's basically divided between those who oppose a Palestinian state because they think that God gave them all the land, and they're going to assert their biblical claim, and those who follow the propaganda that say, well, even if it was right to have two states, there's no one on the other side that would accept that, and so better we have to use violence and force. That's the only realistic thing to do. But voices that say we need to solve these problems through following international law and through justice barely exist in Israel right now. I think this is a terrible, grave danger to Israel's survival, because the legitimacy internationally is plummeting. And I personally don't think that the American people really have much interest in being a party to this. The American people, to the extent that they signed up with Israel, signed up to a two-state solution. They did not sign up to some biblical vision of a greater Israel that controls millions of Palestinian people. They didn't sign up for that.
Putin's recent press conference, he was talking about Odessa. He said that Odessa is a Russian city. It's a huge change in his view. The United States could have saved Odessa for Ukraine if they were going to negotiate with Russia before. How do you see the situation right now in Ukraine? Is there any will in the Biden administration to go after negotiations?
No. In 2010, 2011, 2013, Russia's demands vis-a-vis Ukraine were that Ukraine should be neutral. That's all. And Russia negotiated with the government of Ukraine a lease till the year 2042 for Sevastopol naval base. There were no demands for annexation. There were no demands for territory. There was no claim on Crimea. There was simply a pragmatic approach. Don't join the U.S. military alliance, and our military base, our naval base, which has been in Sevastopol, Crimea, since 1783, should remain there, and we want a long-term lease for that, which President Yanukovych negotiated. That's all the demands. Then the United States overthrew, or was party to the overthrow of Yanukovych. Russia took back Crimea. Even then, there were no demands for the eastern Ukrainian regions, that is the Donbass. What Russia said was stop killing ethnic Russians, give autonomy to ethnic Russians, and that became the basis for the so-called Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. The Minsk II agreement did not call for independence of the Donbass or that Russia would annex the Donbass. It just said autonomy. And it was a position backed up unanimously by the UN Security Council. But the United States said, no, we don't care. Told Ukraine, you don't have to implement that. And so that was lost. Even as late as December 2021, Putin was not making demands for territory. He was calling for the Minsk agreements to be enforced, claiming Crimea and demanding that NATO stop enlarging. Well, the United States government is deaf to the interests of any other place in the world. They're so arrogant that the position is we don't have to listen to anything. And so when President Putin put a draft security agreement on the table based on those premises that NATO would not enlarge, that the Minsk agreement would be honored finally years after it was supposed to go into effect, Biden said, we don't have to negotiate. Russia launched its special military invasion in March 2022, and by then the Duma, the Russian parliament, had recognized eastern Ukraine as independent, Lugansk and Donetsk as independent, did not annex them. That came in September 2022. But in March, it recognized their independence, but Russia demanded Ukrainian neutrality and said on that basis there could be immediate peace. And Ukraine and Russia famously were close to an agreement on ending the war weeks after it had started. Weeks. And the United States said no. And Britain said no. We will not support you. You fight on. Hundreds of thousands of people, Ukrainian young men, have died since then. So this is about American foreign policy, and it's so sad. It is not just demands for territory by Russia. It is the fact that Russian demands keep rising in the context of continuing rejections from the United States. Definitely, the rhetoric has turned even more aggressive, but the White House is so stupid. Sorry, in the U.S., they don't understand anything. But what they certainly don't understand is that Biden should call Putin and say, we've got to stop this. We don't want to see all of Ukraine destroyed. But you're right. We should never have tried to expand NATO. That was really stupid. And you told us that since 2007. That's the call that's needed. But I don't think Biden's up to it. And certainly his neocon team opposes that very premise. Fight on, basically kidnap young people off the streets of Ukrainian cities and throw them to the front line where they're dying by the hundreds, sometimes 1,000 or more per day. That's the policy.
In Europe, we are seeing that new leaders that are coming to power in Netherlands, in Slovakia, we had Orban. They are against this war in Ukraine, against sending more aids, more weapons to Ukraine. How influential would that be on the U.S. foreign policy in Ukraine?
It's having an effect, obviously. Orban by himself blocked the formal approval of the next round of European assistance. Fico in Slovakia will be joining that cause. The government in the Netherlands is still being negotiated, but the party that came out number one, as you said, Wilders, is against further aid. Of course, the new Polish government probably is pretty gung-ho for more financial and military support to Ukraine. Things are dragging out, but most of Europe does their best to follow blindly the United States. This is really tragic, though all of these cracks in the foundation are clearly appearing. What's stunning is if you look up approval rating of world leaders, and one of the websites that reports weekly opinion polling, there's not a European leader that has a net positive approval rating. Most of them are incredibly unpopular. Scholz, Jonas Gahr Støre in Norway, Macron, hugely unpopular. They're promoting war is not winning public support. There's no one in Europe that has a net positive approval rating in this group of NATO boosters, not even close. And the ratings keep going down and down. Look what's happening to Scholz in Germany. It's a collapse of public support. And in the United States, Biden does not have public support for his foreign policy.
We know that Austria are trying to block the new package of sanctions on Russia. Is that possible that Austria can make some middle ground for both sides?
I think that more and more politicians in Europe are understanding this is wrong. It was a terrible mistake. It's not working. They generally are so beholden to the United States, or for one reason or another, afraid of it or bought off, that they don't say in public what they often say in private. But there are more European politicians coming to the fore, definitely saying we've got to stop this, and that will have an effect, not from one day to the next, but it's definitely coming. Similarly, in the United States, public opinion is gone for this. Congress, which listens to the military-industrial complex, is in angst because they want to vote more money for weapons. The Democrats want to support Biden, but it's completely wrong-headed to be sending tens of billions of dollars more without even an attempt at negotiations. So I think that this is a failing policy that will come to an end. It has to, and it doesn't have to, but it's very likely to in 2024. But it's agonizingly slow. And what is so frustrating is the absence of many voices of sanity. Viktor Orban in Hungary is one of them. Fico is a voice of sanity. There are very few right now.
As you mentioned, the U.S. foreign policy is so important. What's happening to the Democratic Party? We know that Cornel West, Jill Stein, even Bobby Kennedy, they're not welcome in the Democratic Party. They have to find their way of fighting in the new election. What the Democratic Party is losing for the next election? How do you see their situation?
Well, I'll give you a personal answer. They lost my vote. I used to be a Democrat. I used to vote Democratic basically all my life. And I have left the party. And I put it in personal terms because I think I reflect a view that is quite widespread. The Democratic Party for me is unrecognizable right now. When I joined the Democrats, I joined originally in the 1960s as I was still in high school, so I was a kid. But the idea was it was at least the part of our political system that was against the Vietnam War. And there was always a strong leftist part of the Democratic Party that was anti-war. And that was what I felt was my home. Now there isn't any anti-war part of the Democratic Party at all. Not in the Congressional Democratic Party, not in the White House. You don't find, other than a very, very few people, any voice for this right now. All the mainstream voices are more war, more funding. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer was at school same time I was at Harvard. I've known him for many, many decades. What's his role right now? Well, keep the Senate in session so that we can still send more money to Ukraine. It's terrible. There's no thinking anymore. It's incredibly ignorant. And this is across the Democratic Party. So it's really quite upsetting.
Is the political arena of the United States ready to have a third party, even fourth party? We have Bobby Kennedy, who was not welcome in the Democratic Party. I don't know what they're thinking of, but he has a very good chance of getting more votes from the Democratic Party. We have Cornel West and Jill Stein. Those are so important candidates to make some equilibrium within the Democratic Party.
I think the mainstream Democrats are extremely confused and befuddled, and the wrong message, and they've lost their way. And Biden is a terrible candidate and has been basically a warmonger during this whole period. So it is a position that is outside of American public opinion right now. They've opened the door more for Trump than just about anything else. I sensed it from the beginning that, strangely, because it's a principle of American politics that foreign policy is not decisive, I said, you're going to go down on the foreign policy, which is really something. It was so bad, so misconceived. I wrote a few articles about that this makes no sense, even politically, much less geopolitically, if I could put it that way. It makes no sense in terms of domestic politics. And this is how things are playing out right now. The American public rejects Biden's foreign policy. He is not going to win re-election, most likely, and certainly not on this approach.
And I want you to specifically comment on Cornel West and Jill Stein. Because
they're fine people. They're not going to be president, most likely. They're fine people. Bobby Kennedy has a much larger following and a much larger position in the polls. And we'll see what the dynamics are now. There are, Cornel West is a wonderful person. I've been friendly with him for decades. I don't know Jill Stein personally. But it's Bobby Kennedy that has the name, the public recognition, the position in the opinion polls, and he certainly has an open chance. I urge him all the time: be the candidate of peace. You'll win if you're the candidate of peace. This is really important. This is what the American people want.
Is it possible for him to convince Cornel West or even Jill Stein to be part of his campaign?
Well, I think right now, they're each going to do their thing. They're each going to run. We're still almost a year away from the election, so a lot can happen between now and next November, and we'll see. But for the moment, they're going to campaign, right now, Bobby Kennedy shows up in the opinion surveys typically between 10 and 20% of support. That's a lot for a third party candidate. And we're early days because most Americans are not really focused on the elections. This is still very much a professional politician thing at this point, and it will only start to heat up at the beginning of next year with primaries and caucuses, and then we'll see how things evolve.
Just before wrapping up this session, I want to know your opinion on this U.S. economic war on China. How is it going with these two conflicts in Ukraine and in Israel? We know that China is doing their way, they're growing. And how do you see right now in the U.S.? Are they focused on the economy? Are they focused on these wars? How these wars going to benefit the economy?
It is pretty much taken for granted among the mainstream of both the Democratic and the Republican parties, I have to say, that China's an enemy. And the rhetoric vis-a-vis China is extremely stupid, low level, ignorant, and dangerous. And this is both parties, because even parts of the Republican Party that are not interested in the Ukraine war, want to stop the funding, to a significant extent say, yes, because we need the resources to fight China. And so there's a kind of comic book feeling to it that, oh, there could be a war with China. That would just be fine and dandy. Of course, it could end the world. It's so reckless and dangerous, the way that our politicians talk, the way the mainstream media report things, say, yeah, coming war with China, as if that's, a normal kind of statement, as opposed to something absolutely horrifying. And the rhetoric about Taiwan, as if Taiwan is the 51st American state, as if the United States doesn't have a one China diplomatic policy, which they seem to forget. It's all quite dangerous. The U.S., starting with Trump, actually starting with Obama in political ways, starting with Trump in trade policies, and now with Biden in trade policies, finance policies, technology policies, is really leaning hard against China. It's doing some damage to Chinese macroeconomics in the short term, because it's really stopped the growth of China's exports to the U.S. market, and Europe has broadly gone along with this. And so that is hurting a bit, but I think China has ways around that, including expanding its role in the non-U.S., non-EU world. And I expect that to happen. China's underlying strengths for growth are very strong. It's a high saving society with excellent education and very strong research, development, and enterprises that are at the cutting edge of many technologies, whether it's electric vehicles or renewable energy or advanced computation. China has great depth and strength. So this is not a fly-by-night economy. This is a very serious and sophisticated economy with a lot of geopolitical support. And I don't think the United States can, quote, contain China. It's a terrible idea, an absurd idea, a dangerous idea, and I don't think possibly a successful idea. Ukraine is getting slaughtered and losing thousands and thousands of young men and now women every week. And it is absolutely a shame of the United States and Europe to continue to feed this human destruction. It's cynical, it's stupid, and it is a complete failure of diplomacy. Where are our leaders that understand it's time to sit down now and negotiate? And by the way, the main negotiation needs to be between the United States and Russia, not between Ukraine and Russia, because this conflict from the start was a conflict between the United States and its NATO push and Russia, and Ukraine was the fodder. And we, yes, provided the weapons and the dollars for hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians to die. And you just have to listen to our stupid, cynical senators who say it's the best money he ever bought. You know, they're weakening Russia and not an American is dying. And the Europeans play into this. So this war needs to stop, and it needs to stop through negotiations between the U.S. and Russia. The core has to be stop NATO enlargement, and Russia stop its war, and peace comes, and there's going to have to be a territorial settlement. Now, if this war hadn't taken place, there wouldn't have had to be a territorial settlement the same way, because we in the West kept playing a losing hand, and Ukraine kept losing more and more as a result of this. And it was completely predictable that this so-called Ukrainian counteroffensive that started in June would fail. But our leaders are so cynical, and they're such liars, by the way, that they said this is going to be a great occasion, and it's been nothing but destruction, and they still don't tell the truth to this day. So we've been saying it for a long time. This war could have been avoided through negotiation. It could have been stopped in March 2022 through negotiation. It could be stopped today through negotiation. But that takes the United States negotiating, and it takes the Europeans just having a smidgen of honesty for a change, and stopping following the narrative of the United States and saying we don't really need this war and we don't really need NATO to be in Ukraine, and we would actually get somewhere through diplomacy.
According to a recent report by Reuters, Germany's economic downturn worsened this month, with both manufacturing and services activity contracting, sliding Germany into a recession. Germany's strong manufacturing sector was hit particularly hard in 2022 following Russia's invasion, as it was heavily dependent on cheap gas from Russia. Amidst the crisis, the German government is embarking on an austerity program that will cut funds in the social, agricultural, transportation sectors, as well as climate change initiatives. One place where no cuts are being made, however, is in the special €100 billion military fund that the German government created in 2022 to counter the threat posed by Russia after it invaded Ukraine. Any cuts on Ukraine aid has also been ruled out by the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And let me quote him here, quote, "If the situation worsens as a result of Russia's war against Ukraine, for example, because the situation on the front deteriorates, because other supporters reduce their aid to Ukraine, or because the threat to Germany and Europe continues to increase, we will have to respond," unquote. In fact, Germany's aid to Ukraine is set to double in 2024 from 4 billion to 8 billion euros. How do you assess German government's action? Should it continue to militarize and support Ukraine amidst a crisis at home?
Look, the German government has utterly failed to help find solutions to make peace and to actually respect the German economy and the European economy. And this is why, unfortunately, Scholz is one of the least popular leaders in Europe, and it's a huge disappointment for me. I like the guy. I knew him when he was mayor. I thought he would be a reasonable and effective leader. He has not been. He's been a huge disappointment. The Greens have been unbelievable. Who would have dreamt that the Greens would be the most militaristic foreign policy imaginable? Maybe not imaginable, but just terrible against European interests, German interests, without a word about diplomacy. It's as if diplomacy doesn't even exist. So this government has been a failure, and it shows up in the polls. Both the left and the right are gaining tremendously. The parties in power are losing support tremendously. This is true election after election right now. It's not surprising. The government doesn't make sense. It doesn't have a strategy. Now, why? Well, I think the basic reason is follow the U.S. No thought that is independent at all. What does Scholz know about the Nord Stream pipeline? Why doesn't he tell us? Well, the U.S. blew it up. Is that really in Germany's interests, in Europe's interests, in the interests of peace? No. Everything's been a lie, but Germany's gone along with it. It's sad. And it shows up politically. This is a failure. The public doesn't support it because it's bad for the economy. It doesn't solve any problems. It's not helping Ukraine. Let's understand this. All this pro-Ukraine rhetoric, Ukraine is getting slaughtered. The longer this goes on, the more territory Russia's going to take. What would have stopped the war entirely is the common sense that you don't push NATO to Russia's border. It's not exactly genius needed to understand that, since it was said repeatedly every day, every year since 2007, don't do it. And why can't the German leaders figure this out? Well, I think again, whether they figured it out or not, it's basically follow the U.S. and don't say a word against this. And it doesn't work.
Let me switch to Israel's war in Gaza and also recap the situation for our viewers. After the October 7 terrorist attacks of Hamas that killed at least 1,200 Israelis, 1,318 of whom were military personnel, Israel responded by declaring war in Gaza. So far, Israel has killed 18,700 Palestinians, 70% of them being women and children. According to the UN, around half of the people of Gaza are facing starvation, 8 in 10 Gaza are now homeless, and a total of 1.9 million people have been displaced. On the 12th of December, the United General Assembly voted to demand an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. A clear majority that included 150 nations voted in favor of a ceasefire, while 10 voted against it and 23 abstained. The most powerful nation that voted against a ceasefire was the United States. Today, the United Nations Security Council will vote on another resolution drafted by the United Arab Emirates that calls for an urgent and sustainable cessation of hostilities to allow safe and unhindered humanitarian access. It is expected once again that the United States will veto this resolution as it did earlier this month at the Security Council. Could you first assess Israel's response and thereafter talk about why US continues to shield Israel on the international stage?
Absolutely. Look, this is, again, a war that has political roots. And I think every German listener should know von Clausewitz on war in 1832, after the Napoleonic Wars, said that war is a continuation of politics with other means. At least that's the English translation of von Clausewitz. And this is a war that is a continuation of politics. Now, what's the politics here? The government of Israel wants to rule all of the land from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. Hamas, in this case, in Gaza, wants to rule all the land from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. The Palestine Authority in the West Bank says we want a two-state solution and has agreed with international law and UN Security Council resolutions for decades. The main point to say right now, from my point of view, is that the mass destruction of a civilian population being carried out by Israel is not only mass war crimes, tantamount to a genocide, according to many legal experts, but more than that, is in pursuit of a completely illegitimate political aim, which is the so-called Greater Israel, in which there is only Israel ruling over all of Palestine. This is not subtle, what I'm saying. This is the words every day of Netanyahu and of extreme right-wing cabinet ministers, including Gallant, the Minister of Defense, so-called, although it's offense, the Minister of Finance, Smotrich, the Minister of Interior, Ben-Gvir. These are radicals. And what they say is one country, Israel, which governs everything as a Jewish state and with control over millions of Palestinians, or with ethnic cleansing of millions of Palestinians. So let's be clear. The second point to be clear is that this war continues each day with the United States arming Israel in real time. In other words, not just supporting Israel in a vote in the Security Council or in the General Assembly, not just supporting Israel through past shipments of munitions, but daily supporting Israel with new munitions. In other words, this is a U.S.-Israel war. It's not just an Israel attack on Gaza. It is an Israel-U.S. war on Gaza. It is against international law in countless ways. It is killing thousands and thousands of people, mostly women and children, each week right now. it is destroying hospitals, schools, basic infrastructure, homes. As you mentioned, it's displaced at least 1.9 million people. That's a lot of people to have been displaced in a few weeks. That's because Israel bombed with U.S. bombs the housing of millions of people. And then it sent them to the south of Gaza and then bombed in the south of Gaza. And it's not even subtle. We have to move beyond the idea that this is somehow subtle. It's just like Ukraine. The facts are out there, even if the mainstream media will not report them. And the facts are that in the Hebrew press in Israel, Netanyahu makes absolutely clear, we are against completely any Palestinian state. We are against any control of Gaza by Palestinians afterwards. We are out to make Gaza uninhabitable. This is not subtle. So it has to stop immediately. And my view is we need the Security Council today, I'll put it that way, to vote 15-0, that it is international law under the UN Charter that this war stop and that two states, that a Palestinian state is established and two states live peacefully side by side, and the UN Security Council puts in peacekeepers to enforce the will of the international community. This is not about new negotiations between Israel and Palestine, because Israel has said quite clearly it stands flagrantly against international law as expressed repeatedly since 1967 by the UN Security Council, starting with Resolution 242 and in 1973, 338. So we need peace. Now, why is this happening? Because the United States is blocking it. That's it. And in the United States, public opinion is turning sharply against Israel, especially young people. And the administration is shocked at that because it's been a standard assumption of U.S. politics, always side with Israel. Well, that may be what certain groups want in the United States, but it's not what the American people want. They see war crimes in front of their eyes. They want the war crimes to stop, and they don't want America to be complicit in those war crimes.
Whenever the US casts a veto, the argument that is usually made and which is widely circulated in the German media is that the UN resolution text that is drafted never condemns Hamas's violence or recognizes Israel's right to self-defense. What do you make of this argument that is casted whenever US invokes a veto?
I think that this is completely irrelevant and beside the point. What is relevant is we need the fighting to stop and for two states to exist. And the United States is providing the munitions for an extreme right-wing government that explicitly is against any Palestinian political rights. So this isn't Israel saying, we need our security, but of course we recognize Palestinian rights. This is an Israeli government saying we do not accept any Palestinian political rights. So you cannot support what is a complete violation of international law, not only the laws of warfare against civilian populations, but the political need for two states to live there. Because otherwise, all you're doing is supporting directly a government that claims ethnic cleansing or claims the right of apartheid, or something even worse.
I want to highlight some developments taking place in Germany in regards to Israel and Palestine. In November, the use of the slogan, "From river to the sea, Palestine will be free," became a criminal offense in Germany, punishable by a prison sentence of up to 3 years or a hefty fine. However, the statement, between the sea and the Jordan, there will only be Israeli sovereignty, which is stated in the founding charter of the Likud party from 1977, the party which the current Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu heads, has not been criminalized by the German government. Furthermore, starting this month, a written declaration of commitment recognizing the right of the State of Israel to exist must be submitted in Eastern Federal State of Saxony-Anhalt in order to obtain German citizenship. Commentators and analysts are warning that these moves by the federal and regional governments pose a danger to civil liberties. How's the situation on your end across the Atlantic in the United States in terms of civil liberties and academic freedom?
Well, we have lots of student protests. We have lots of powerful interests trying to shut down the student protests, but they're not going to do it, and they're not able to do it. And that's because there are war crimes underway. What you say is absolutely right, that you have two sides that are claiming exclusive political rights, whereas the whole international community is saying two states, and that's been the international law since 1967, that Israel is in occupied territory and a settlement needs to be made with Palestinian political rights based on 4 June 1967 borders. And so to criminalize one side where the other side is the government carrying out mass war crimes and murder in the name of Greater Israel, it's something really sad, shocking. Come on, people, open your eyes. What's happening right now? This Israeli government is an extreme right-wing government that doesn't hide its aims.
What do you think there's this difference between the way West approaches Ukraine? For example, when Russia annexed Ukrainian territory, the West was very quick and swift to impose sanctions, condemn it publicly, and do everything possible with the ICC to pursue Putin and his cabinet. However, when it comes to Israel, the West has regularly condemned Israel for its settlement expansion. But why has it not followed up with sanctions? On one hand, it implies international law and all this lofty rhetoric when it comes to Ukraine. But on the other hand, you only have rhetoric but no concrete actions. What is behind this double standard?
Well, I'm sorry to insult European governments and leaders again, but basically the United States calls the shots, period. So we don't have to look too deep at Europe. We just have to look at what the United States does. And the United States does not exactly operate with any consistency. It operates with interests, with imperial interests. In Ukraine, the imperial interests are to expand NATO. This is, again, not subtle. This was spelled out in 1997 by Brzezinski and pursued ever since. In the case of Israel, it is to support Israel no matter what. That's the U.S. security state position. Europe, I'm afraid, doesn't have almost an independent thought in its head, in most cases, with a few exceptions like Pedro Sanchez in Spain, who's actually thinking. But not Meloni, not Scholz, not Macron. It's sad. Come on. This is Europe. Europe should think. And instead, they're parroting the United States and don't look for consistency according to principles in the U.S. Look at U.S. interests perceived by the security state. And that is a might makes right ideology. And in Ukraine, it means we fight to weaken Russia no matter how many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians lost. And in the case of Israel, it means we arm Israel to carry out its mission because for a variety of political reasons, the United States government, not the people, but the government backs Israel unconditionally, at least to this moment. But we should look at the world opinion. The world opinion in both Ukraine and Israel is the same. Stop the fighting. Don't side with U.S. imperialism of expanding NATO alliance, or don't side with Israel's attempt to crush any kind of Palestinian political sovereignty. Abide by international law. And that would actually get us somewhere. And Europe is lost because it follows the U.S. The U.S. doesn't have principles. The U.S. just has thought for the last 30 years that power is enough. But power isn't enough. It doesn't solve anything. And Israel is going to destroy itself actually over this because it's losing its international legitimacy, including in the United States, by the way, including in the young people of the United States. There's a complete change of opinion in the United States among young people. And so I don't think Israelis understand this. And as long as there are these neocons in power, which is Biden, Blinken, Nuland, Sullivan, they've been there a long time. And there are the neocons in the other party as well. So this is a deep state phenomenon, not just a set of personalities. As long as that continues, there isn't going to be peace.
To my last question, we are currently in a crowdfunding campaign to continue our independent journalism in 2024. Why is it important for viewers to support independent journalism that does not take any money from corporations and governments and provides an alternative perspective to the mainstream media?
Look, the mainstream media shut down in recent years. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, MSNBC in the United States, worthless. They don't tell the truth at all. Oh, the war is going great until it's not going great because they lied all along the way. Nord Stream, we didn't hear a word about it. In Israel, they're just shocked. They don't understand that the American public isn't siding with the official narrative. But these mainstream media outlets have revealed themselves to be utterly subservient to the official narrative. And in Europe, there's even outlawing statements that are obviously true. It's not even a matter of truth or false. So it's a really bizarre situation, but the saving grace has been that there are more ways to be heard now. And this is extremely important because the truth does get out. And what's interesting about the official narrative, by the way, people don't believe it. They get hit by it every day. They read it, but the status of the mainstream media in public respect has plummeted. People know it's not true. So everyone's looking for outlets right now where truth can be spoken. This is why the alternatives are so vital.